Okay, can you see this? Yep. Okay, I'll just go off.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Hey, well, thank
Can
you
you make
so
it
much.
full screen if it's easier? If it's convenient, can you just make it? Yeah. Thank you. Doesn't matter if it's okay. Not if it comes at a cost, but okay.
Yeah. I'm
all right.
Some bandwidth issues, but okay.
Oh, I see.
This should be
okay. All right. Okay. Great. Thanks.
Sounds good. Well, I thank you to the Academy and the organizers for the invitation and incredible audience and panel. As mentioned, I'm have been working as an economist at Microsoft for several years, and also here at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm sort of coming to you today largely with my Microsoft hat on. I will sort of add some economic points of view as we go along, but really just want to kind of give you a little bit of perspective into Microsoft's journey into the sort of the net zero goals and targets for both the company and the world as a whole. So I think just to start out, just zoom out for a moment before we jump into Microsoft. What is it that Microsoft is looking at as it sort of thinks about this problem? Well, the basic science is pretty grim. So we need to sort of keep temperature no more than 1.5 Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels by the end of the century. The Earth has already warmed 1.2 degrees Celsius relative to that goal. So there's not a lot of margin left there. And if we just look at what science says, and this is where sort of the net zero initiative arises, is that we need to stop adding more carbon to the atmosphere by 2050, by the middle of the century. And we think about carbon math, it's simple, but it's worthwhile pointing out that it's net zero is emissions minus removal. So there's a basic credit and debit system here. So we need to hit emissions equals removals by this 2050 time period. So, that's kind of the global macro scenario. Now, where are we today? So, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that the world, even the developing world, is still industrializing. So we're in the midst of what is sometimes known as the fourth industrial revolution. This is the coming together of our digital and physical spheres. It's powered by devices, Internet of Things, machine learning, artificial intelligence. They're all coming together in new and novel ways to solve new problems and build new applications. And when you think about the industrial process that sits behind this fourth industrial revolution, it's sort of depicted here in this picture on the left. And what is that? That is a data center. Okay? A data center is modern day industrial complex, sort of the factories of the future. And what is it that data centers produce? They produce applications. The applications that get streamed to end users through high-speed networks. We are sitting on a Zoom call right now. We are consuming a stream, which is an application that's produced by an underlying data center. That data center happens to be an Oracle data center, not a Microsoft data center. But nevertheless, this is sort of the picture of what this fourth industrial revolution entails. And this matters because what is powering this? What is the oil that goes into these factories? And this sort of gets into the famous expression many of you have probably heard of, this notion of data is the new oil. And I think it's perhaps a bit of a hackneyed expression at this point, but when you really think about it, it has multiple layers of truth associated to it. So I think Hal Varian recently has pointed out that, like oil, in order to be useful, data needs to be refined. So raw data often does not solve problems, but it needs to get processed through machine learning and modeling and data science in order to get into an interpretable decision posture. So that's kind of one prism through which the metaphor makes sense. But there's another real sense of the sort of analogy here, which is data literally has to be burned. So what's going into these data centers are servers, which are depreciating over a roughly 2 to 4 year time scale. And what goes into the servers is data. And when we think about applications and the electricity carbon footprint that they have, it's pretty remarkable. So here's a stat that comes from a recent study, and it just shows at the bottom there, you can see the carbon footprint of training a high-dimensional machine learning natural language model. This would be a model of the form of GPT-3 or BERT-style architectures. And we can see it's about 626,000 pounds of CO2, which is 5 times the equivalent of an average US car. And so, so we are literally burning resources to produce these applications. And so I think that's sort of worthwhile bearing in mind that industrialization is still happening. It's just taking a very new form. And so, so what is it that Microsoft is seeing sort of in terms of the solution? And I think this is where some of the hopeful, optimistic side of the equation starts to get realized, is that there are pathways here. And I think if the speakers we've just heard from have sort of started to demarcate what some of those pathways look like. This is a stylized scenario, but I think the key part to really emphasize here is that it's a portfolio approach to the solution. And let me kind of call out 3 major elements that certainly Microsoft sees when it thinks about its strategy. One is just efficiency. We have to get more efficient about emissions, which is consumption of energy resources to power our lives and businesses. But another important part is zero carbon electricity, or what is sometimes known as the decarbonization of the electricity grid. So we need to move electricity to renewables that do not have a carbon footprint. I'll talk more about that momentarily, but if we get to zero carbon electricity, then we need to electrify. So move sort of applications that currently rely on fossil fuels to electricity sources. And then a sort of 4th element here is removal. Okay, actually physically extracting or pulling carbon from the atmosphere is another arrow in the quiver. So I think it's really important to realize that it is a portfolio approach, and we have to bring all of these approaches to bear on the problem. And sort of with that as backdrop, what is Microsoft's sort of position on this very pressing problem? So first of all, Microsoft has a very robust sustainability strategy today, and I want to emphasize that sustainability at Microsoft means more than just carbon, and sometimes it gets forgotten that it's carbon, water, waste, and ecosystem more broadly. It happens to be that carbon, of course, is the most mature and developed of those domains, but sustainability at Microsoft means all these things, and there's really given equal attention at some level. But carbon has certainly made the most headlines, and I will sort of remind everyone that last year Microsoft put out a pretty remarkable goal for itself, to which it's holding the company accountable, to be carbon negative by 2030. So that's Brad Smith on the left, to be the president of Microsoft on the left, to remove all of our historical carbon emissions by 2050, Amy Hood in the middle, and then we have Satya on the right, which is complemented by a 3rd pillar, which is a $1 billion climate innovation fund that is reinvesting back into marketplaces and technologies for helping address and solve this problem. And as we think about, I want to sort of give some complexion and color into what that exactly means. So what does it mean to be carbon neutral? And the carbon math here is really important, how we think about the accounting. And so when we think about emissions from a company perspective, there are 3 distinct scopes. There's scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1 is direct emissions, just what your own business activities emit into the atmosphere. Scope 2 includes scope 1, but it adds electricity consumption that goes into the running of the business. So that's a multiplier on top of scope 1. So we go from, Microsoft has today about 100,000 metric tons of scope 1, about 4 million metric tons of scope 2, and scope 3 is emissions from the entire supply chain. Okay, so it includes the carbon footprint of all the input purchased materials, outsourced activities, contractor vehicles, business travel, etc. And that's going to be another multiplier on top of scope 2. So today for Microsoft, that's about 12 million metric tons. And so when Microsoft aims at a net zero goal, it actually has scope 3 in mind. So the full scope of all emissions as really the key to the solution. And another sort of important point is we don't talk about carbon neutrality anymore. So this is about net zero, and that's really important because neutrality implies the purchase or investment in offsets, and that's not tied to getting us to the net zero goal. And let me kind of just give you a picture of what that looks like from a Microsoft perspective. So this is sort of a pathway of how Microsoft intends to get to its goal by 2030 of net zero emissions by 2030. Black is the actual net emissions. The scope 3 output emissions are the blue bars. Okay, so we can see them peaking, and now they're starting to get they're starting to go down. I'll kind of explain a little bit more as to how they go down. The dark green were the offsets that Microsoft used to employ as part of its carbon neutral strategy. And you can see in the light green, that's now getting replaced by active investments in carbon removal from the atmosphere. Now today, carbon removal is 1% technology or engineering based and 99% nature-based solutions. But to get to the 2050 goal, to get to the end of the century goal, yep.
I'm sorry, 2 more minutes, please.
2 more minutes, sure.
Yeah.
Let me mention. Let me just sort of pause by just end by saying, kind of, now that we sort of understand the strategy, let me just mention one thing really fast here, which is the renewables are a key source of how emissions are going down. So we are now pretty much almost indexed to about 60% renewables. Today, we're looking at about 100% renewables for our electricity consumption in 2025. So let me close by saying, why is Microsoft doing this? And if you were to ask Satya, if you got him on a phone, he'll tell you something along these lines. At a time when many are calling attention to the role technology plays in society, our mission remains constant. It grounds us in the enormous opportunity and responsibilities we have to ensure that the technology we create always benefits everyone on the planet, including the planet itself. And so this is an example of a mission-based approach to the problem, and you will see many companies embody this mission-based approach to the problem, which is sometimes called stakeholder capitalism, which is to say the modern enterprise does not think about shareholders as the only stakeholder. It is shareholders, customers, suppliers and partners, employees, and you can see Satya here saying that the stakeholder is the planet itself. And one of the key ideas of stakeholder capitalism is that all the stakeholders have mutually aligned interests in the end. And let me say that I think that's a very powerful view, but I don't think it actually departs from just the basic economics of the situation. So let me give you a little bit of the dismal science view on this. Is that one reason Microsoft is doing this is that because it's feasible and desirable. So Microsoft is partly doing it because it can do it. It has immense resources, it has technological capabilities to experiment, optimize, and implement sustainability programs, and its acquired learnings will transfer to the rest of the economy through multiple channels and touch points. But the other reason, the desirability part of the equation, and I'll just kind of conclude when I run through these points, is that sustainability at the end of the day is a long-run differentiator. And if we think about going to a supermarket and scanning your cereal box, today we might look at nutrition, we might look at the picture of the cereal box. In the future, we're going to be able to see the entire supply chain history of how that cereal box was produced. And the key idea here is that sustainability is a source of product differentiation at the end of the day. And that is going to drive, the theory is that is going to drive spending behavior as spending power moves to millennials and Generation Z. And then the last point is that a sustainability focus just is good for business. It improves efficiencies. I have not come across a single sustainability program at Microsoft where it didn't just make business sense to do it, because a lot of what goes into succeeding in sustainability is just running your business smarter, faster, using the power of data and AI. And I'll just close by saying you can't affect what you can't measure. And a hard part with sustainability is just being able to measure your business activity. But being able to measure your business activity and its carbon impact, is a major shift into that digitization, digital transformed modern company. And I think that's going to be a critical, essential part of the journey, both in Microsoft and the economy more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. Thank you. The discussant is Steve Tadelis, professor of economics at UC Berkeley. Steve is also a member of the academic committee of Luohan Academy. He worked at eBay and Amazon as chief economist and VP. Steve, it's your turn.
Could you hear me okay?
Very well.
Okay, thank you very much.
I don't see your screen yet.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nain. Thank you very much, Amit. Good to see you after a while and learn about Microsoft's efforts. And, you know, I was asked to comment on this. Well, you know, full disclosure, I'm not an energy economist. The good news is nobody on this call seems to be, or almost no one seems to be. So I guess we're all trying to figure out what's going on here. And you know, when I thought about the presentation and what Amit described, I kind of think, you know, big tech and net zero, like, wow, how is this going to imply anything about the world? And, you know, surprise, surprise, I did a quick search, and only less than 4 months ago, there was this article from Bloomberg Green, April 7th, 2021, where it states that of the 10 largest US companies by market value, only 4 have announced plans to reduce their emissions by net zero by 2050. As it turns out, they all happen to be technology companies: Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Facebook. And it turns out that Google claims to have already been achieving that target, being fully offsetting since 2007. So that, of course, is interesting that we have this move. And the questions that come to mind are, well, what kind of impact is this going to have, since this really is a very global issue with the familiar commons problems, right? So the Prism's dilemma, tragedy of the commons, many names to the same phenomenon, where we're all suffering from global warming. Nain gave a great overview of just some recent anecdotes. And of course, once you have more than 3 or 4 anecdotes, it starts looking like a data set, and all have happened in very recent history. So the first thing that comes to mind, can big tech really move the needle, or is it a form of greenwashing? Well, one of the things that Amit described towards the end is that, in fact, for many of these efforts, it seems to be, what's called doing good and doing well in the social responsibility angle. Namely, companies are doing good for the environment, but by doing so, they're also saving costs and so on and so forth. So there may indeed be just pure incentives for companies to pay a little more attention to their footprint. There's more and more research that's coming out about the so-called behavioral IO, companies acting in ways where they're really not maximizing profits. They're focused on a few goals, a few KPIs, but maybe as people start really looking under the hood of how their emissions and footprint in terms of the environment are affecting things, there may be ways to hit that double bottom line. So that's one thing. At the same time, we have to remember something about the scope. So I did a little bit of searching. It turns out that Apple has about, give or take, 25 million tons of emissions. Kazakhstan, which is number 20 on the list of emission producers, has about, I think, 390 megatons. So, you need something like 14 apples to be one Kazakhstan. Now, on one hand, it's like, wow, that's actually, Apple has quite a big footprint. At Amazon, I'm sure it's quite substantial given the logistics and everything that goes around. But when you look at the top 20 countries, for example, well, that makes all the big tech in the world look like a tiny dwarf. So the question is, how could this have an impact? We'll think about that in a second. Another question that struck me as interesting, and this is following some stuff I read by my good friend and colleague, Severin Bornstein, at the Energy Institute at Berkeley. And he's written some lovely blogs about related issues. Also, Jim Bushnell from UC Davis, who's also part of the Institute. Are zero targets helpful or harmful, right? As economists, we know that what we'd like to do is have social marginal cost equals social marginal benefit. And it may indeed be that the kind of efforts that Amit referred to, namely going beyond net zero, are more effective than net zero. At the same time, we know from, again, the kind of behavioral incentive theory, if you will, that when you set targets and you don't meet them, it could cause backlash, it could cause people to be unhappy with what's going on, and maybe even abandon these efforts altogether. So there's some nice jargon that goes on here with the zero net impact, but at the same time, that may be a little too simplistic, and we want to be more nuanced. The next thing that comes to mind is, what are the distributional impacts? So something that I learned recently is, so here in California, you have more folks using solar at the home level, and they push it back into the network and so on and so forth. But what's really happening is that the people who could afford it are wealthy people. Possibly just like maybe among businesses that could afford to go down this route, even if it does do good and do well in the longer term, are the larger cash-heavy businesses. Now, what does that mean? It means they reduce the marginal use of the network, but the network has a tremendous amount of fixed costs that need to be covered. And this is why these industries are typically, natural monopolies and are regulated. So what happens as the wealthier, and maybe tech, starts moving off the grid, so to speak, imposing the costs of the grid on whoever's left, which typically seems to be poorer people. So there's an interesting regressive tax aspect of the wealthier moving on to net zero. And to conclude, and I want to leave more room for discussion, I kind of thought, well, what might be a channel that big tech could really have an influence on moving the needle, given that they are a drop in the bucket? And big tech is in the news a lot. Big tech receives headlines, just as you saw from this Bloomberg article. Maybe big tech can influence public opinions. And if public opinions move enough, that will loop into politics and policy change. So that's where I want to feel optimistic that the kind of efforts that Amit described, that Microsoft, and as we see here from the Bloomberg article, other companies are doing, may have a much bigger impact than their footprint by themselves. At the same time, I look at what's going on with vaccines in the United States, where there's so much discussion, and the way people respond is just mind-boggling. So I'm not sure public opinion is the channel that could indeed move the needle. I still want to be hopeful that it can, and I will end here.